The evening air grows still, and the shadows lengthen. I am your companion for the night. Elias Thornwood and I invite you to listen as the story of Eleanor's return unfolds within the walls of a house touched by time. The carriage wheels groaned against the gravel as Eleanor arrived at the house that had once been her home. Wrapped in a mourning cloak of deepest black, she stepped down into the cold evening air, the fabric of her dress whispering against the stones. Before her the house loomed, its ivy-clad walls bathed in the fading light. Years had passed since she last crossed this threshold, and yet as she lifted her gloved hand to the door, time seemed to fold in upon itself. The great oaken door creaked open, and there, waiting in the dimly lit hall, stood old William, the family steward. The flickering glow of candlelight caught upon the silver of his hair, deepening the lines upon his weathered face. But his eyes, steady, kind, were unchanged. "Welcome home, Miss Eleanor," he said, his voice carrying the warmth of an old friend. She stood there in the doorway, veiled in black, her figure slender and still beneath the weight of mourning. Her hair, once the color of honey in sunlight, now seemed dulled by grief, tucked beneath a modest bonnet, pale, yes, but not fragile. There was strength in the set of her jaw, in the quiet dignity of her bearing. Her eyes, dark as peat and just as deep, held memories that no one could name. She looked like a woman stitched together from sorrow and survival, elegant in her silence and terribly, beautifully human. For a moment, she could say nothing. The years had touched him gently but unmistakably, carving deeper furrows into the face she had known since childhood. How many times had those same hands lifted her into the saddle? How often had she found comfort in his quiet presence, when storms rattled the windows and the world beyond seemed too vast, too uncertain? William had never been merely a servant. He was the guardian of this house, of its people, of her. She glanced about the hall, her fingers trailing lightly over the polished wood of the banister, pausing for a moment on the cold, carved frame of a mirror. The scent of beeswax and old books lingered in the air, as familiar as the lullabies her mother once hummed. And then something else, a darker scent, the acrid tang of cigar smoke. And through it all, William had remained, a fixture in this place, a tether to a past she was no longer certain she wished to reclaim. The house stood solemn and grand, its stone facade softened by ivy and time. Inside, candlelight flickered against the walls, catching in the crystal teardrops of the great chandelier that hung from the vaulted ceiling. The hush of the great hall wrapped around her, filled with the lingering scent of aged paper and lavender, the warmth of smouldering embers in the great stone hearth. Tapestries still adorned the walls, rich with scenes of hunting and revelry. And rows of bookshelves towered along the edges of the room, their leather-bound volumes silent witnesses to the years that had passed. Once this had been a house of warmth and laughter, of candlelit suppers and music drifting from the pianoforte in the drawing room. And yet, beneath its beauty, beneath the gilded mouldings and painted frescoes, there was something else. A quiet settled deep in its bones. The hush of a place that had learned to mourn. Eleanor stood still, her gaze tracing the edge of a tapestry worn thin by time. She swallowed against the swell of emotion rising in her chest. It is as if nothing has changed. William nodded solemnly. Some things endure, miss. Others fade. But you'll find this house remembers you still. A wistful smile flickered across her lips before she turned, stepping deeper into the home that had once been hers. The fire had been lit in the drawing room, its golden glow casting long shadows upon the walls. Lowering herself into an armchair by the hearth, she stretched her fingers toward the warmth, though the chill within her did not break so easily. William placed a cup of tea before her, his voice gentle. I shall look in on you later, miss. Rest now. But as he turned to go, she spoke. William, stay, if you please. He hesitated only a moment before nodding, settling himself in the chair opposite hers. For a time there was only the soft crackle of the fire, the distant patter of rain against the window panes. I half expected never to see this house again, she murmured at last. William gave a thoughtful nod. Yet here you are. She let out a breath barely more than a whisper. And here you are. You have not changed. A faint smile touched his weathered face. Time slows for old men. She studied him, the familiar kindness in his gaze. I thought of you often, she admitted. I wished I had written. There was no need, he said gently. I knew you had your reasons. Her throat tightened. It was not a life I would have wished you to know of. William was silent for a moment, before setting down the fire iron and moving to stand beside her. No one blames you for leaving, Miss Eleanor, and you'll find no judgment here for returning. She turned her gaze toward the hearth, watching the flames curl and dance, licking against the iron grate like memories stirring from the past. I do not know if I have truly returned, she confessed, or if I am only a shadow wandering between past and present. William's voice was steady, quiet. A shadow does not warm itself by the fire, nor drink tea, nor speak of things long left unspoken. You are here, miss, and that is enough. The words settled in her chest, their simple truth sinking into the spaces grief had hollowed. A deep sense of gratitude softened the edges of her sorrow. "I had forgotten," she whispered, "what true kindness felt like, William." His smile was small, a knowing look in his eyes. "Some goodness holds its ground, miss." A soft silence stretched between them, broken only by the wind whispering against the window panes. At last William spoke again. "There's a storm coming. You should rest." Eleanor nodded, though sleep had been a stranger to her for some time. The past clung to her like a heavy veil, and she knew rest would not find her so easily. As William left her to her thoughts, Eleanor let her gaze drift to the fire, watching the embers flicker and glow. Shadows wavered against the walls, whispering secrets of a childhood now lost to time. She saw her mother's soft smile, the gentle weight of her father's hand upon her shoulder. And then darker recollections crept in, the sharp words of her uncle, the suffocating presence of the man she had married, the sorrow that had led her here once more. The weight in her chest grew heavier. At last she rose, drawn toward the window. Beyond the glass the hills stretched out in endless waves, the moors wild and untamed beneath the bruised sky. The storm had not yet broken. There by the hearth in the great quiet house, the warmth of the fire should have soothed Eleanor. Yet it stirred the embers of memory, pulling her back through the veil of years. She closed her eyes, and the fire's glow became the golden sunlight of her past, illuminating a world that no longer was. She could almost hear her mother's laughter again, not as a faint echo, but as it truly was. Light, musical, spilling from the drawing-room and into the gardens where it mingled with the scent of roses. She saw her father's strong, steady hands lifting her high into the air until she felt she could touch the clouds. Their love had been a fortress, warm and unshakable. A world unto itself where she was unconditionally safe. But even the strongest fortresses fall. The memory shifts, the sunlight fading to the cool shadows of a closed house. He recounts the whispers in the halls, the cloying scent of lavender and sickness that clung to the heavy drapery. He speaks of her vigil at her mother's bedside, a child clutching a frail, cooling hand, whispering prayers that went unanswered into the solemn quiet. And then the great silence fell, and she was left an orphan, adrift in a world that had suddenly grown cold and unfamiliar. A log in the hearth collapsed, sending a shower of bright embers skittering across the hearthstones. Eleanor blinked, the vision receding, leaving her back in the present moment. Her gloved fingers curled around the delicate porcelain of her teacup, its heat a small anchor to the here and now. But then, the scent of wood smoke seemed to twist into something darker. The scent of her uncle's study, thick with cigar smoke. She remembered being summoned there, to that room of dark leather and darker shadows. She had been barely 17. He had not looked at her, but at the heavy ledger on his desk. The man her uncle had chosen for her was not just wealthy. His investments could save this very house from being sold off piece by piece. Her marriage was the final, highest price to be paid for her family's legacy. She remembered his voice, cold, clipped, carrying the weight of finality, as he spoke the words that would seal her fate. "You will do your duty, Eleanor." She had stood there, a silent ghost in the room, while he discussed her future as though she were an asset to be managed. There had been no malice in his voice, but no kindness either, only the detached pragmatism of a man settling accounts. Her protests had been brushed aside, as inconsequential as dust from a mantelpiece. A gust of wind rattled the window pane, a mournful sound that pulled her from the memory of her uncle, only to leave her in the shadow of her husband. She recalled the chill that would enter a room with him, the way his presence seemed to take up all the air, leaving none for her to breathe. She remembered the quiet cruelty, the words like fists that could bruise her spirit without ever leaving a mark. He had once told her that an obedient wife does not question, and in his world she had learned to be silent, agreeable, unremarkable. She had faded, retreating into herself until she was nothing more than a shadow moving through a beautiful house that had never once felt like a home. The fire crackled again, its dancing flames a welcome distraction, pulling her back to the present. He was gone now. The thought should have been a release, a breaking of chains. And yet why did his shadow still cling to her? The house had welcomed her, but the ghosts of the past had arrived with her, slipping through the doors as unseen as breath. Sleep, as it often does for a troubled heart, eluded Eleanor that night. So when dawn cast its first pale pearlescent light over the distant hills, she rose, restless, aching for air that did not taste of the past. The house, though a haven, felt heavy with ghosts, echoes of laughter and sorrow woven into its very walls. She needed to breathe, to move, to feel the world beneath her feet. Wrapping herself in a heavy woolen cloak, she stepped out into the morning hush. The air was cool and clean, laced with the wild, sweet scent of heather and damp earth. A fine mist curled over the hills, veiling the world in a soft silver haze, as if the land was still dreaming. The moors stretched before her, vast and untamed, rolling like the waves of some ancient forgotten sea. She walked without direction, letting the land guide her. Beneath her boots, the ground was springy with moss softened by the night's lingering dew. The wind at first was a friend, tangling gently through her hair, whispering secrets only the wild could understand. Here, away from the house, she could almost breathe again. She climbed higher, and the vast emptiness soothed her, making her feel small in a way that was not frightening but freeing. Her heartbeat steadied to the rhythm of her steps. The weight in her chest began to lighten. But the sky was shifting. The wind grew more insistent, its voice deepening as it threaded through the gorse and bracken. Heavy clouds, the color of bruised plums, rolled in from the horizon, swallowing the soft light of morning. A single drop of rain, cold and deliberate, kissed her cheek. Then another. The storm, when it came, was merciless in its swiftness. The wind sang a wild, ancient song across the moors, and the rain came down in determined sheets of silver, washing the world clean. Thunder cracked overhead. A sound not of malice, but of something old and brittle in the world, finally breaking apart to make way for the new. She pressed on, her boots slipping in the deepening mud, each step a small victory against the elements. The world blurred around her into a swirl of grey and green and endless rain. The cold had sunk deep into her limbs, but it was a clean cold. A cold that seemed to burn away the lingering scent of cigar smoke and sorrow. Somewhere in the distance, through the roar, a voice called her name. Faint, yet urgent. The storm tried to swallow the sound, but it was a human sound, and it held on. Her knees at last buckled. The soft, wet ground rose up to meet her. And then darkness. But even in the deepest dark, a helping hand can find its way. The storm had unleashed its full fury upon the moors. Inside a handsome carriage making its way toward the town, Mr. Alistair Gray sat in quiet thought. He had been in the district for only a few seasons, and the wild, untamed nature of these moors was still a world away from the orderly life he had known before. He found that the stories here, like that of the returned Lady Eleanor, seemed to rise from the very soil, ancient and steeped in a sorrow he could not yet understand. Beside him, his young son Thomas, oblivious to his father's thoughts, pressed a small hand to the cold window pane, his breath creating a temporary fog. He wiped it away, his eyes wide with curiosity at the passing landscape dissolving into a swirl of grey. Suddenly the boy's small voice cut through the rhythm of the storm. "Father, look, there is a lady sleeping in the rain." Alistair's head snapped up. He followed his son's gaze and saw it, a dark patch of fabric against the green and grey of the hillside. Unmoving, with an urgency that startled his driver, he called out. The carriage groaned to a halt. Without a thought for his tailored coat, Mr. Gray opened the door and stepped out into the heart of the storm. The shock of the cold rain on his face took his breath away, and the wind tore at him, a physical force pushing him back. He pressed on, his fine boots sinking into the slick, treacherous earth as he made his way up the grassy incline. There, collapsed in the heather, was a woman. It was she. Her face was pale as marble, her lips tinged with blue. He knelt, his hand gently touching her forehead, and felt the dangerous heat of a rising fever. She was unconscious. He gathered her into his arms, a woman who felt as light and fragile as a fallen bird. And at that very moment, a figure stumbled over the crest of the hill. It was old William, his face a mask of weary desperation, his clothes as soaked as her own. Thank the heavens. William breathed. I feared the worst. She is safe now, just cold. The fever is beginning to take hold. Mr. Gray replied softly. We must get her to warmth. Aye, sir, the house is ready. I know the quickest path, even in this storm. Follow me, William urged. And so, a strange and silent procession was formed. William, the loyal steward of the past, hurried ahead, a sturdy shadow leading the way home. And Mr. Gray, the compassionate stranger, carried Eleanor back towards the carriage. He settled her gently onto the seat, and with a heavy thud, the carriage door closed, shutting out the roar of the storm in an instant. All was suddenly quiet. He wrapped her in a thick, dry woolen blanket from his own travels. Its rough, warm texture a comforting contrast to her cold, damp dress. Inside that small, warm space, a bubble of safety moving through the wild night. Eleanor was, at last, on her way home. The fever took hold quickly, a great and final storm within her. For days she drifted on a restless sea, tossed between memory and shadow. In her visions, the cold voices of the past returned, her uncle's clipped dismissal, her husband's quiet cruelty. They whispered that she was a shadow, that she was nothing, but this time they were not alone. Faint at first, then stronger, other voices rose to meet them. William's steady kindness, her father's joyful laugh, and a clear, urgent call from a storm-swept hill. A voice she did not know, but one that called her back to the world of the living. And then the fever broke. She awoke not suddenly, but gradually, as if surfacing from a deep, dark water. The first thing she felt was the cool, smooth touch of fresh linen against her skin. The second was a profound lightness in her limbs, as if the storm had truly washed the very weight of sorrow from her bones. A gentle golden light filtered through the curtains, and the air smelled of chamomile and clean rain. She turned her head, her body weak, but her mind, for the first time in years, quiet. And there, in the armchair by her bedside, sat old William, fast asleep, a book open on his lap. He had kept vigil. Seeing him there, a quiet tear of gratitude traced a path down her temple. She was home. A few days passed in quiet rest. The color returned to her cheeks and a steady light to her eyes. One afternoon there came a soft knock at the door. It was Mr. Gray. He stood there, concern still shadowing his handsome features, though it was softened now by a gentle smile. "Miss Eleanor," he said, his voice as calm as she remembered it from the storm. I hope I am not intruding. I came to see how you were faring. She managed a small, genuine smile in return. I believe I am quite difficult to get rid of, Mr. Grey. He chuckled, a warm and pleasant sound. The village whispers spoke of a shadow returning to this house, he said, his gaze direct and kind. They were wrong. I see only light. The words settled over her, a balm on old wounds. Why, she asked, her voice barely a whisper, why would you do so much for someone you did not know? Mr. Grey paused, his gaze thoughtful. The storm was no place for anyone, he said simply. And a house like this deserves to have its lady home. I thought you might like some fresh air, he said at last, offering his arm. The gardens are said to be quite lovely after the rain. And so together they walked from the quiet shadows of the house. He led her not to the main grounds, but to a small, secluded area she knew well. The Moon Garden. But now it was a world transformed. In the bright, clear light of a new day, the white roses and silvered leaves that had been ghostly in the moonlight now sparkled with life, heavy with diamond-like drops of rain. The air was rich with the scent of damp earth and blooming petals, and a lone blackbird sang its clear, bright song from the branch of an old oak. She lifted her face to the sky, feeling the gentle warmth of the sun on her skin for the first time since her return. She was no longer a shadow watching from a high, lonely window. But a woman standing in the sun, ready to see things grow again. The storm had passed. A new day had begun.